In today's episode of Jess Finds New Ways to Mess Up Her Planner, we have this. But before we get to that, what are we actually doing today? So for my February setup, I wanted to go with a vintage science theme inspired by Periodic Table Day, which is on the 7th of February. And as part of that, I wanted to age my pages, or make them look kind of vintage. So a little discolored, ripped around the edges, and thus the burning. But before we get to the burning, I am going to have to stain my pages. As you can see, the pages of my Archer and Olive notebook are very white, which isn't quite the vibe that I'm going for with this setup. So what we're going to do first is tea stain these pages, which means we're going to have to go downstairs and make a cup of tea. With the way that I'm doing my tea staining, I'm going to need quite a concentrated cup of tea. So we're boiling the jug with the minimum amount of water and making a 3 tea bag strong, quote, cup of tea. I don't put too much water in the bowl because I want this to be a really concentrated solution so that I don't have to apply too much water to my pages. Realistically, the pages of a regular Archer and Olive notebook aren't really made to take water. Yes, they can take small amounts if you're doing watercolor or something similar, but for tea staining, if we apply too much water, we are going to get significant page curling. This wasn't something that I was too worried about because I feel it kind of adds to the aged look that we're going for on the pages, but it is something to be mindful of if you wanted to do this for yourself. Flipping to the first page of what is going to be our February setup though, you can see I'm putting some paper behind the page just so that I don't have any tea accidentally seep over and interfere with the pages that I've already set up for January. As said, I don't want to apply too much water to the page, so I squeeze out some of the excess water from the tea bag, but I am still keeping it fairly wet and using this to paint the page. The nice part about using the tea bag to paint is that because it's absorbent, I've still got a fair bit of water in there, so if I need some extra moisture, I can just squeeze it out very carefully onto the page. To get the tea to the edges of the page though, I also had a paintbrush handy. This is because using the tea bag to paint is a little bit more uncontrolled, and just to make sure that I don't have too much moisture sitting at the edges of the page and then, possibly seeping underneath the page and ruining other pages of the notebook, I decided to go in with the paintbrush for that part. This was also useful for the spine edge of any of the pages because you don't want too much moisture there either. The tea will either end up slipping underneath the pages and getting onto other pages that you don't want there to be tea on, or it could also end up soaking into the binding and soaking pages that way. If you're worried about that, you could always mask off the very center of the page, but I was really careful doing mine so that this wasn't as much of a problem. I also used the paintbrush to pick up some extra of that tea water and add it directly onto the page, just so that I could achieve some variation in the concentration of the brown on the paper. I don't want it to be all one consistent color, I want to have variation and splotches and stuff like that. But adding this much water to your page does mean we are going to get curling and it is going to take a while to dry. To help with the dry time though, I decided to use my embossing heat tool, which I have pretty much never used in my journal, so it was nice to get to use it for this. And heating up the tea on the paper honestly made my office smell like a bubble tea shop. Along with the heat tool, I also used paper towel to dab off any of the excess moisture on the page. This also gave some good splotching effects, which added to that inconsistency that I was looking for. To get the overall look that I wanted though, it was a couple of rounds of adding tea, drying it off, adding tea, drying it off. You'll also see in the bottom right there that I have the lid to a spice jar, and I used this to add some rings to the page as well. Kind of as if a cup had been set down on the pages. But of course, this is supposed to be mimicking an old science book, so I'm going to assume it was a beaker or maybe a conical flask, even though the circle's probably a little small for most of those. I do like the effect it added to the page though. If you're looking to do tea staining with the same materials I used, I'm just using an English breakfast tea, but of course all of the equipment I used in this setup is linked in the description box below. Along with the tips that I've already mentioned regarding the tea staining, another one that would be worth mentioning is that as you heat the pages up when you're drying them off, they are going to probably curl. For this reason, I decided to leave a blank spread between my February setup and the ones I've already got for January, and then my plan was to use double-sided tape to stick that blank spread together. I just wanted to make sure that I had everything set up before I did that, so I haven't actually done it in this video. It's not really a necessary step, but I thought it would be nicer to have no blank spread between the 2 months, even though I needed it there to make sure I didn't mess up my January pages with my tea staining for February. Before we get into the rest of the setup, we are going to have a look at how January was going though, and if you watched that plan with me, you may remember that our theme for January was rubber ducks, in celebration of Rubber Duck Day, which was on the 13th of January. This has been a really fun theme. I liked the little ducks. I thought that they made for really simple decoration, especially because I effectively drew one rubber duck that I liked and then traced it on every page that I wanted an extra rubber duck. My Zig Clean Color dot marker came in handy to do those bubbles, which were also just another simple decorative element. I've really found that my setup has helped to keep me motivated to work on my action steps and my habits and all of that kind of stuff. Originally, I was intending on using weekly logs for January, but I ended up putting so much pressure on myself at the start of the month to find effectively the perfect weekly that I just didn't do them. I ended up going with dailies instead, and really that's been working quite well. So at this stage, I'm planning on continuing that for February. Now as all of our pages are tea stained though, another thing that I wanted to do to add to the aged look was to rip the edges of the pages of the monthly setup. I'm doing this very carefully just along the edge so that I still have 12 centimeters of dot grid boxes on each page. I figured that 12 centimeters was a nice amount to still work with. It doesn't limit me too much in terms of what I can set up, and keeping it consistent on each page gives me a rough marker of where I need to rip the paper. The left-hand page of this spread though is going to be my projects list for the month ahead. This one's just a handy list of all of the major things that I work on in terms of my content creating. I do also add an other section to this for anything that might be like house related or personal related, but it's nice to have this go-to list throughout the month to keep me on track. Also, it acts as a way to prompt me to come back and have a look at my cover page, which previously I wouldn't come back and enjoy. For the decoration in this setup, I effectively just wanted the pages to look like they were from an old science notebook, so I'm really just putting in things like scribbly science notes or little illustrations of glassware. I wanted everything to be very much chemistry focused, which was kind of tricky because if you go online and search things like science notes or vintage science notes, a lot of the stuff that comes back is either physics or biology. A lot of biology. Probably because that ties in a little bit nicer to the whole like dark academia vibes or whatever. Honestly, I don't know what dark academia is, but shh. Originally I was planning on drawing everything in with a black pen, but I thought it might be a little nicer if the decoration kind of blended in with the page a bit more, or looked a little bit more old or faded, so I instead opted to use my sand-coloured Staedtler Tri-Plus fineliner. This also helped the titles and my actual writing stand out against the page. Because typically I'm writing on white paper, the black stands out really well, but in putting black on this tea-stained paper, it doesn't stand out quite as much. You don't have quite as high a contrast. Because using my journal to help keep me productive and things like that is pretty important, I need to be able to see my tasks and notes and other information really easily. So I didn't want it to get lost in the decoration, so I decided to make the decoration a bit more subdued. Now as we're flipped over though, we are on to the monthly log, and we're going with the typical calendar layout that I like to use, where each of the boxes of the calendar are 6 dot grid spaces across and 6 dot grid spaces down, or 3 centimeters by 3 centimeters. Using the ruler on the now tea-stained paper was an interesting experience, because obviously the pages are now a little bit warped. It meant that some of the dots didn't actually line up as perfectly as they would previously, but I did manage to get my lines in nice and straight. I do typically like to use quite a thick pen to do my outlining for my calendar boxes, just because I like it to stand out, and I think that was even more important with now doing this on the tea-stained paper because of that aforementioned contrast issue. For all of the headers in this setup, I wanted to use a lettering style that looked kind of old, messy, effectively looked kind of like legible doctor's writing, which essentially just meant that I went with a sped up version of my regular handwriting using a Tombow Fudenosuke brush pen. By doing it fast, it meant that you don't get that really kind of clean black color. You end up kind of getting some streaking of the pen, which I feel just added to the old and scrappy look. Looking at the pieces of lettering individually, I'm not overly sold on it, but I do think it ties in fairly well with the theme and looks okay altogether. We're just going to ignore the S's for Sunday and Saturday. They really could have been done a little bit better. Around the outside of the calendar though, we are putting in more of that decoration, and in particular I wanted this decoration to be centered around the elements of the periodic table, considering this entire theme is in celebration of Periodic Table Day. I just did these as little 1.5 by 1.5 centimeter squares with the element's name, their symbol, the mass number, and the atomic number. Effectively, it fits the same format that you might find on the periodic table. I wanted this page to look quite full though, so in amongst all of those, I also added some notes about different scientific concepts, in particular those related to chemistry. So things like distillation, vapor-liquid equilibrium, the Vesper theory. All of these notes you can effectively find on Wikipedia, so if you want to do this kind of a theme for yourself, you don't have to actually, I guess in theory, understand the theories. You can just pick out ones that have cool words. Of course, being an ex-chemistry teacher, I do have some understanding of these things, one would hope. And in amongst the notes, I also drew in some other little diagrams like organic molecules, a half equation for dichromate, an energy reaction profile, and a little acid-base reaction. In terms of the timing for our setup today, that one was a little bit hard to judge because the tea staining took the longest amount of time, but it was also done at a fairly leisurely pace and wasn't recorded. For the actual drawing out of this layout though, that one came in at about 30 minutes, whereas drawing out the projects list and cover page took about 16. As always though, this time doesn't include sketching in time or idea generation time. Flipping on over though, and our next spread is going to be for tracking. In particular, my action list, so tracking things for my goals and my goal action steps, and my habit tracker. Last month we had a self-care tracker and a separate habit tracker, but it turned out that I actually only included 2 things on the habit tracker, so I decided to recombine them for February. It just means that the things that I'm tracking on my habit tracker are primarily going to be self-care related. My intention for having them split in January was that I wanted my habit tracker to just focus on things that were goal related, but it turns out that my current goals don't have a lot of daily actions associated with them. There's not a lot of things that I actually need to do on a daily basis to work on those goals. The goals are more weekly focused, so individual things to do each week, or they're one-off or monthly tasks. You can see that the action list looks pretty simple at the moment. It just has the actions list header and then the subheader for the one-off and monthly actions. And that's because I like to list these out first and have enough room for all of them before I list out my weekly and then daily actions. Rather than guessing how much space I'm going to need for each of those, I'd rather just wait until the end of the month, figure out what all of my actions for February are going to be, and then put them in once I know how much space I need for each of those. For my habit tracker though, this one I already know what I want to be tracking, at least in terms of the habits that I've been tracking in January. I want to continue with each of those, also with the addition of using my journal daily. While I have been pretty good at keeping up with my bullet journal in January, I know that's also because my motivation is really high at the start of the year. February is going to be a lot busier for me, and I know that when I get busy, I get much less inclined to use my journal. So having that on my habit tracker, I'm hoping is going to help incentivize me to make sure I'm actually getting in here, getting things written down, and getting things checked off. This one took about 12 minutes to pen in. Remember, this time doesn't include the tea staining, but now we can flip over to another tracker page. This one is for my Instagram schedule and posting elsewhere. I found this page super helpful in January because I'm not really very good at being consistent on Instagram, so having a place where I can either plan out what I want to post or just record what I have posted was really useful. The structure for this layout is pretty straightforward, so we just have a row for each of the days of the month and then 3 columns on each page. On the left-hand page, the 3 columns are all for Instagram. So my first, second, and third post of the day. I'm only going to be including feed posts, so pictures or reels if I make any, rather than story posts, which I do a little bit more casually or, when I have something to share. On the right-hand page though, as the title suggests, this is for posting elsewhere, so in particular thinking about my YouTube community tab, my Facebook page, and my Facebook group. Some of these I can schedule in advance. For instance, on YouTube, every Wednesday I like to do a reshare of an older video that has some kind of significance to either content that's coming up or the time of the year. And then for any video that I post on YouTube, I also like to highlight that on my Facebook page. So any posting day for YouTube also has a corresponding post on Facebook for that video. I just want to be a little bit more consistent about posting in effectively all the places, because that's certainly an area of growth for me. In terms of timing though, this page was fairly straightforward to set up, coming in at about 14 minutes. Flipping over though, and our next spread is dedicated to my monthly reflection. Now I haven't filled in my monthly reflection for January, but I am planning to, because this is also an area of focus for me this year. I absolutely love my monthly reflection pages when I actually fill them in. So having it pre-set up with the different sections that I can reflect on different aspects of my life come the end of every month is pretty important. This one was super quick to set up because it doesn't have any decoration outside of the tea-stained paper, just to make sure that I have plenty of room to do all of my reflection notes. Sections that we have on this one include my wins, any challenges that I faced or improvements that I want to make, memories from the month. We also have a space to review my finances on the top right, a space to reflect on what I did or didn't like about my bullet journal or planning system, a place to note down what goals I worked on during the month, and then some other spaces that are designated to things that I'm looking forward to, things that I'm nervous about, and any other notes. This setup is looking pretty good, but I wanted to add some colour to those torn edges, and to do that, we're going to be using fire. But we are certainly not going to be doing it at my desk inside because I do not want my office to smell like smoke. So we're grabbing our journal and matches, and an oven mitt for protection, and we're heading outside. If not only for the smell of smoke, I also don't want my burning of my journal to let off any fumes in my office. It's good to be in a well-ventilated area. It goes without saying, but please be careful if you're going to be using fire near anything. Funnily enough, it's hot, and we don't want you to burn the things that you're not intending on burning. For me, I just wanted the very edge of my pages burnt. I just wanted to add a little bit of colour to those torn edges. So my oven mitt was very much less about protecting me and more about being able to pat down the fire so it didn't encroach into areas on the page that I didn't want it to be. While I do still stand by doing this outside because you don't want your house to smell like smoke, Wellington is windy, so it was hard to get my matches to stay alight to allow me to do a decent job of burning the edges of the pages. But I will say I am very chuffed with how it turned out. One thing that I was sure to do after the burning was to wipe down my pages with some paper towel just to get rid of any ash, mainly because I didn't want to bring that into my house, and I also didn't want it smudging on the pages of my setup or other pages in my journal. Technically speaking, you could do this effect with pen, I just like the realism of using matches instead, and it was fun to experiment with new materials, but I probably won't be doing it again anytime soon. Heading back into the office though to have a look at what we've done, I am very chuffed with this setup. I really loved the ripped edges, the tea staining turned out really well. I'm actually just very impressed that I managed not to get tea on other pages that aren't part of the February setup, and I'm looking forward to using this setup in the month ahead. If you are still on the hunt for February bullet journal inspiration, then I do have a playlist of all of my previous February setups, or if you are looking for more monthly setups in general, then the playlist at the bottom is where it's at. Click or tap on either of those and I'll see you over there.